similar to what we have done before. And because of that previous show of hands, we're going to skip most of it. But as you see, spirituality, resilience, and community as kind of one complex of ideas, sort of the psycho-spiritual side. This is what most people think of when they first hear the word sabbatical, because of the, particularly in a college town like East Lansing, right? When, as it's filtered through academia or clergy, the professions that expect a continual well of new insight and ideas. It's not that professors or clergy work harder than anyone else, but there's something about the kind of work that gets to the classic difference between a well and a cistern, right? A cistern is carefully plastered so that it holds the water that you put in it, and it will be there for later until you exhaust it. But there's no replenishment automatically. A well is simply tapping into the aquifer, the groundwater, and unless you consistently overpump the entire region, which we're going to talk about because that's a sustainable agricultural issue. But the idea is you can keep coming back to the well, and there will always be new. So, you know, that's a real question for all of us in a way. How are we cisterns and how are we wells? And so the resilience, community, spirituality angle speaks to that. We're going to do that second. The first, quite literally, the focus on agriculture, because that's where these texts begin. Again, Shmita literally means radical release. Lishamet is to let go, to release. And the thing we call the Shmita, this big year out of 7, is of course that. We've seen all these different frames. And as a reminder, we started with Shmita and climate because there is no time to waste. And that is the sort of central challenge facing us right now. Interestingly, Adat Shalom, my Reconstructionist synagogue here in Bethesda, Maryland, is having a conversation at 5 o'clock with 3 state legislators organized by our climate action team. So as soon as I get off this, I'm jumping on that. And I already recorded a greeting for them that talked about Shmita. What do you know, right? So this is incredibly relevant, and state legislators are learning about it. That was a helpful frame because the large conversation there, of course, is thinking long-term. That is above all the focus. The idea of thinking in 7-year cycles, and 7 of those with the bonus 50th year of its cousin, the Yovel, the Jubilee, really take us out of the short-term thinking that characterizes our problematic modes and puts us hopefully on a trajectory of sustainability and justice. The justice piece, the economics and the intergroup realities, the historic inequities that grow like a Monopoly game, unless you break the cycle with a soft reset every 7 years and a hard reset every 50, that is one of the core teachings on Shmita. It connects to the racial justice work that is a hallmark of the Reconstructionist movement right now. If you have not heard, tapped into the national efforts, our friend Rabbi Deborah Waxman, the head of the movement, is doing amazing work with this. The new academic dean at RRC, our alma mater, Dr. Amanda Mbubi, is an absolutely remarkable scholar who's doing this work. And our colleague, Rabbi Sandra Lawson, one of the first rabbis of color in the world, is on the staff now, specifically making this work happen. I cannot sufficiently say how important it is to underline that racial justice piece. That is around Shmita, that is also around our collective future as a beloved community, using, of course, the language from Dr. King, whose birthday is coming up. But that's also one part of a larger set of matrices of justice and sustainability that includes the economic reality. Today, was a catch-all description when I jotted this down months ago. And all life here means literally the life of growing things, things that live, which is the agriculture side, but also our lives, what makes the human experience at the level of soul a little different, and that's where spirituality and community kick in. The final session, I've got some ideas, but essentially we're going to take it where you want it to go. So looking forward to Shmita, us, and you just 4 weeks from today. You may remember from the first time, I asked literally what's growing, and I want you to just look. I found this beautiful picture online, and I am not a botanist. I believe there are some in this community who are. So yeah, Paulina?
Here in northern New Mexico, an hour away from my house, it's fields and fields of lavender.
Okay, thank you. I thought that it was lavender proper with that color, but I wasn't sure. And yes, fields and fields of lavender. And that's a fine example of something that has been harnessed for human use in a whole number of medicinal and artistic and even nutritional ways, though we don't think of it as a staple crop, but it is also habitat. It is also part of there are supposed to be fields of lavender in places like northern New Mexico. So what's growing is the proper question, and what's our role in figuring out what's growing? By the way, is it grayed out right now? Can you see the words "what's growing"? Good. Okay. I can never tell with the screen share. We're all still learning. All right. So among the questions to begin to drill down, literally what's growing within and without. And I raised that at the beginning, but that's really today. We're going to start what's growing without at the agricultural conversation and then move to what's growing within at the psycho-spiritual. And remembering we have all of these frames: resilience, justice, sustainability, renewal, forgiveness, reimagining, rethinking, releasing. It's all part of the same conversation. And the key verb is tishmetena. You shall let it radically release. You shall radically release it. So we're basically going to skip the next few that are the short review, then go to agriculture, then go to resilience and spirituality and community. Here's Tishmetena when we meet it in Exodus 23. 6 years you shall sow, gather in its abundance. 7th year let the land, let it rest and lie fallow, so that the poor and the beast of the field may eat. That's all we learned the first time. We have in the background, and we'll look in the final session at some texts that actually suggest that the whole purpose of Shmita is a theological exercise to remember what it says in Leviticus 25 further down, that ki li haaretz, the land is mine. And right before that is the second introduction to Shmita, again with agriculture, but a slightly different language, a bit more theological. The land is observing a Sabbath of God. And the same thing about the 6 years, 7th year, a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of God, in case you missed that. And a year of complete rest for the land. Shnat Shabbaton yihye la'aretz. And again, the special concern for slaves and laborers, the inclusion of female and male, of human and non-human, citizen and non-citizen, they're all in there. The third time we meet it, in the very next chapter, Parshat Bechukotai, at the end of the book of Leviticus, reminds us that if you don't listen to the covenant, if you harden your hearts, if you are not living in right relationship with each other, with the land, with the universe, your land will not yield its produce. I will scatter you among the nations. Your land will be desolate and your cities ruined. Notice at the beginning of this, in chapter Leviticus 26:18, I will discipline you sevenfold. That's not an accidental number. What, not fivefold, not tenfold, not double or triple, sevenfold. And here is the specific. That's when you are in exile, when you are suffering and hurting and disempowered, the land is making up for its Sabbath years, because while you were on it, you were supposed to give it its rest, and it's gonna get its rest no matter what. It will make up for its Sabbath years. It shall observe the rest that it did not observe in your Sabbath years when you were living on it, and it will be desolate. And later text, I'm dwelling on this a little bit in the intro because it's so directly connected to the agriculture and the sense of the urgency of sustainable agriculture, lest your entire civilization prove unworthy and lose its claim to the land, which happens. There's history of this all over, right? The Easter Islands, the question of how did it become desolate 4,000 years ago? Ancient Mesopotamia, why its downfall. For that matter, the US and the Dust Bowl connected to the overdrawing of the Oglala Aquifer, back to the image of wells. So we need to practice sustainability. We need to think about the land's need to rest, or else we will not dwell securely on it for all of that time. And Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the ancestors or first principles, says, and this is really old, the Mishnah is right after the Torah, right after Tanakh, in the sort of historical development of our people. And Galut, the exile, and they're writing this right around the time of the Roman Galut, the destruction of the temple and the Roman diaspora. Galut ba'al olam, exile comes into the world for a handful of things which we think of as cardinal sins: idolatry, sexual immorality, and murder. Those are the three classic cardinal sins in Judaism. But there's a fourth one in this ancient stratum of text: failure to observe the Shmita, va'al hashmatat haaretz. So this stuff is real. We're even told this is what happened in the first exile in Babylon, that in fulfillment of the word of God, as Jeremiah had prophesied, until the land paid back its Sabbaths, the Babylonian exile continued. And again, how we are all in it together. I was going to take this slide out because I wanted us to go quickly through, but we are meeting just after that first anniversary of January 6th. And it just feels important to say, we're all in this together. And then, of course, Deuteronomy and the debt release. This is what we talked about last time, and the radicalness of the idea that we have to release debt every 7 years. And that is actually directly connected to agricultural cycles. So I'm jumping right to Shmita consciousness so we don't dwell on last month's subject, but these are images again from the Orthodox community about, look, you can do it. We can actually celebrate the words of Torah in a very literal way. We can debate that, but they want us to believe that. And kudos to those who try to fulfill what they see as biblical writ. We are taking it in a slightly different direction. But for farmers, and of course, we all depend on farmers, even as we celebrate being part of academic and other enterprises that don't require the same amount of manual labor. But where would we be without them? The reality is, if you're a farmer and you have a bad year, A, the people around you probably had a bad year too, because it had to do with the weather and the climate and natural cycles. But B, if you did not have enough crops last year to go beyond feeding your family and sell at market, then you are already poor and disempowered. And people live on the edge. They didn't have enough necessarily for years and years of this. That's why multi-year famines, like in the book of Genesis, are so bad. But also, you may not have seed. So what are you going to do if you were that poor and you had to eat everything you could raise last year? How do you plant for next year? And so farmers are at the mercy of whatever conditions a lender is willing or to make, right? The farmer has to accept. because they simply need resources they don't have after a tough year. So the cycle of debt remission is actually connected to the agricultural rest in its infancy, in its origin, but it reminds us of our potential dependence on others and how predation can so easily enter the picture if we don't always center justice and equity along with sustainability. So that's the farmer's reality. Again, we are in it for Shmita consciousness, not to practice what Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy say, but to be inspired by them and build a world that bakes those values in at the center. A good example of that, Einat Kramer from Teva Yisraeli, in the last cycle, they're doing it again, Shmitat Yisraelit. What would an Israeli liberal Shmita look like? And as she writes here, and I think this one is new. I think I just put this one in. I could be wrong, but I don't think you've seen this before. That Torah relates to Shmita primarily in the context of an agricultural society. Of course, that the agrarian basis of our society in the time of Torah. A contemporary approach understands Shmita as a lens through which we address pressing issues in realms of education, social equity, culture, industry, and more. So the goal is to return Shmita to its rightful place in Jewish life, a once-in-7-year chance for reflection and rejuvenation in all sectors of society. Yes, and where would we be without that most foundational sector of agriculture? So our first part, we're going to look at what the most literal Shmita meant and could mean for us, then we're going to discuss. And then, assuming there's time, we're going to go and look at the spirituality community side of things and discuss that, and then we'll call it a day. Already 11 or so years ago, our synagogue planted an organic garden on site with some amazing help from some people who really know what they're doing. My son is about to become bar mitzvah. This was him at 1.5 with his binky hanging down and a tomato the size of his head from the very, very first harvest. So I'm a little partial to this photo. You'll see it again. But the idea of practicing sustainable agriculture as a Jewish community, long before even the previous Shemitah cycle, we realized we don't know Torah if there isn't dirt under our fingernails. The first order, right, the Mishnah, the first post-biblical authoritative document in Jewish tradition closed around the year 200, the Mishnah is organized in 6 orders, and the first order is called Zra'im, seeds. That shows just how agriculturally oriented our ancestors were, biblical and rabbinic. What does it mean to be part of a Jewish enterprise if we aren't living those rhythms? 20th century early Zionist thinker Aleph Dalet Gordon would update that in an almost neo-mystical and socialist way of saying, who are we if there isn't dirt under our fingernails? He only would write his academic treatises by candlelight after a day of backbreaking labor in the fields of Kibbutz Degania, because he knew that the thought process was vacuous if it wasn't literally grounded. A challenge perhaps for all of us today in professions like synagogue life and university life. I wanted to start though with non-agriculture. We saw that the text prioritizes the cattle and the wild beasts. We have this in Psalm 148 in the opening of the Shabbat liturgy. Right before Kol HaNeshama Tehallel is another Hallelujah psalm that has all these couplets of these things and these things praise God. It works really well to Michael Row Your Boat Ashore, right? Ha-chaya v'chol behema, hallelujah, eitz pri v'chol arazim, hallelujah. And I pulled out those lines because the pairing there is the wild animal and the domesticated animal, the evergreen tree and the deciduous tree, right? The fruit-bearing and the non-fruit-bearing. In both cases, it's the parts of nature that are obviously useful for people and the parts of nature that easily could be seen as getting in the way or even a danger, and yet they too are part of that chorus. So Robin Wall Kimmerer, the amazing contemporary author, know the world as a neighborhood of non-human residents. We are neighbors with everything else as well as everyone else. And so part of the conversation about sustainable agriculture is making sure that our agriculture doesn't take up too much of the world, because a crop field is a biotic desert. If we are producing staple crops on a stretch of land like you see along I-96, right, then you are essentially trying to get rid of everything but that one species. You are literally killing with herbicide the wrong plants, and you are poisoning with pesticide the critters that would naturally otherwise be there. And while we of course need that food, it's a real question. So this whole issue of right relationship, this is a beautiful piece from Rabbi Natan Margalit recently that just, you see in the middle, our job in this life is and always has been to recognize our kinship with the world, to connect with the holy sparks as partners, together with them serve God. And that is why, you look at the bottom, Shmita reminds us that the benefits we enjoy come to us as part of our relationship to the source of life and the earth itself. We are partners with and not owners of creation. And that is really the meta value of the Shmita conversation. How does that then play out today, right? So Evan Eisenberg, very wonderful author and important voice in this, Wilderness in Time and Sabbath in Space. This comes from his amazing book, Ecology of Eden. Ecologists estimate that at a bare minimum, 5 to 10% of an ecosystem must be preserved if it's to stay at all healthy. Make it a 7th, 14%, you have a margin of error, right? So he's really speaking about Shmita as something that we can use geographically, spatially, as well as temporally. And we are joining a culture's sense of space to its sense of time, setting aside 7ths of our time for holiness, as in the Shabbat, and it's really 2/7 because it's the full Shemitah year as well as a Shabbat every year. I mean, Shabbat 52 times every year. So why not 7ths or 2/7 of our space? What would it look like to dedicate that and to be dedicated to that? Study I saw just before winter break. Cropland has gobbled up over 1 million square kilometers of Earth's surface just in the last 20 years. And this is just worth thinking about, because you see, the areas in white where the cropland isn't, we know many of them to be deserts, and we know many of them to be inaccessible mountainous regions, and essentially anywhere that we can, we have, and that's a problem. The global cropland footprint increased 9% in just the last 2 decades. That is roughly twice the area of Spain, highlighting how Earth's land is becoming, in essence, a unified global farm. Does that sound Shemitah-esque to you? And we've got a lot of hungry mouths to feed, and this inevitably is going to touch on the questions of population and population control for sustainability, which instantly has to bring up women's equality and women's empowerment, lest that we go down that path that has been taken way too many times. These questions are real. Can Earth sustain itself if we turn every bit of arable land into cropland, which equals, in many cases, biotic desert for all but that one species. Half the new fields have replaced forests and other natural ecosystems like peat moss, which is a huge carbon sink that we desperately need, right? Threatening efforts to conserve Earth's increasingly precarious biodiversity and avert catastrophic climate change. Here in my neighborhood, Matt Hansen at the University of Maryland, the inexorable march of the human footprint is just brutal. Shmita asks us to ask those questions. And with that said, the practice of agriculture itself needs to bear that in mind. Yakir Minella, amazing guy who just took over Hazon, the leading Jewish environmental organization, interviewed here recently in Tablet. Shmita is one of the deepest and most profound teachings and mandates of Torah. And he talks about kashrut, asking what is fit to eat within a climate crisis. Those are Shmita questions that we have to ask all 7 years of the cycle by thinking about these values that Shmita helps us locate, but then baking it into our ongoing practice. How do we invest in regenerative, sustainable agriculture that lets us have a sustainable food system for the other years of this cycle? This is Yakir. Think about our food practices in a way that prioritizes social and ecological well-being. This is Shmita consciousness. And this begins to suggest that what we put on our plates and what's in our fridge and our purchasing and what we do at shul and what we do at our kids' school and what we do in the workplace, and for that matter, the state mandates that are being formulated a couple miles from you at the Capitol complex, right? That these things, they are Shmita questions, whether or not it's a Shmita year, whether or not it's entirely Jewish or biblical in any way. To see how this idea has played out, this is Maimonides about 800 years ago summarizing the law for us. It is a commandment to divest oneself. This is the letter of Shmita, to divest oneself from everything the land produces 1 year in 7, quoting Exodus. So if you lock your vineyard or fence off your field, if you still treat it as private property in the sabbatical year, you are violating, nullifying, literally, hollowing out a positive commandment. That's heavy language for an Orthodox rabbi to use, right? This is also true if you gather everything into your home. This isn't about private. This isn't about your 401k doing well. This is about a collective good. One should leave everything hefker, ownerless. And thus, everyone has equal rights in every place. Again, quoting Exodus. Only bring a small amount of produce into one's home, as you do from ownerless property, enough for this meal. And if the poor person is going to starve, the rich person is going to starve on exactly the same schedule, because we are all in this together. It sounds radical. This is Torah. This is Maimonides. The Chazon Shmita sourcebook has beautiful questions that I just want to plant the seed. We'll pick these up in the conversation in just a couple minutes. A normal harvest, do you agree that actually implies ownership and possession? Right? How much of what we buy at Kroger or Myers Thrifty Acres, if they still have that, or right, right, you know, or Target or what have you, how much of that is private and how much of that isn't? Seems obvious, right? If you take something from the store without paying for it, it's shoplifting. And if someone takes something from you on the way out, it's theft. And yet, how much of it is really ours to begin with, right? Your garden produce, the produce you buy, is it your own property? And if we remove fences, how would that affect recognizing land ownership. If we do this 1 year in 7, and that is the year that is holiest, what does that tell us about our models of land ownership in the first place? Obviously, agriculture has shifted over time. So what are some other ways to consider expanding fair and healthy food access for all peoples inspired by Shmita values? Think specifically urban food deserts, the intersection of social and racial and economic justice with environmental. And finally, and I'm as guilty as anyone on this, what about that impulse to stock your pantry and be ready for the zombie apocalypse or just for a long winter, right? And how much food we have and how much of it ends up going bad or gets chewed up by critters, or we don't like it anymore by the time we get to it, right? Think about how you prepare and consume food at home if we're really all in it together. So recently, the UN had a food systems summit. There was a people's counter mobilization, very colorful, reminding us that farmers, not corporations, feed the world. And that is true and not, right? Because actually, the vast majority of the farmers today, at least in developed nations, are turning around and selling their product directly to a handful of corporations. Agribusiness is part of this conversation and can't not be. Keep that in mind as we realize that Shmita insists that we eat seasonal. There's this notion called biur, just like biur chametz, you're supposed to sweep away and get out of your house any little bit of chametz on the eve of Pesach. Well, similarly, on Shmita, as soon as something is exhausted in the field, if the figs have stopped growing on the local fig trees, then you are not allowed to hold on to the dried figs that you bought at Trader Joe's. They aren't yours anymore. You actually have to make them public. That is the logic of biur. In other words, you're only eating what is seasonal. You are also, of course, eating local. And there's a whole set of halakha we're not going to get into, but it actually prioritizes local. That's hard to do in central Michigan in January. It's not impossible if you're resourceful, if you think about indoor gardening, if you think about hoop houses, if you think about canning and preserving, and then making sure there's enough for everyone. When it goes out of season, you can still eat local. And no food waste. This notion of kedushat shvi'it, there's special holiness to the produce of this year. None of it should be, and I'm just quoting Maimonides again, none of the food in 1 year in 7, which is really to say none of the food ever, should be left to turn into garbage, and none of it should be prepared or used in a wasteful manner. Eat seasonal, eat local, no food waste. Permaculture, for those who know cutting edge agriculture ideas, is very much part of this Shmita conversation. What would a system look like that bakes this in? Something that gives you time to reflect on what is actually happening in front of you, observing your land for a full year before placing any permanent features, and then considering everything. The USDA has an initiative, a member of our synagogue was intimately involved, KYF2, Know Your Food, Know Your Farmer. Here's a modern Orthodox Rabbah Rachel Cole-Feingold with a beautiful online shiur who summarizes the penultimate chapter of the Mishnah on Shvi'it. There's an entire tractate of Mishnah and Talmud devoted to this. And in summarizing Perek 9, the Shmita ethic really encourages us to pay attention to what's happening in our surroundings in nature in a very local manner. You hear everything we're saying about permaculture and eating local, here it is, right? And in many ways, this halakha of biur, removing Shmita produce when it's exhausted in the field, is reflective of Shmita's whole ethic. A time to pay closer attention to what's happening naturally in the world around us. And in the same sentence, a time to evoke generosity, to give of what we've grown to others around us. and forge a sense of community. There's then a whole debate over this thing called safiach, what grows naturally, leftovers of things that you expect to be annuals. They're not perennials. They're not going to come up no matter what, and yet some do anyway, right? Wheat is a good example. You want wheat in big quantities, you need to sow intentionally. But some wheat, wild wheat, is there anyway. And so what is it acceptable? Biblically, yes. Rabbinically, no, because of the transgressors, right? So essentially, you see in number 3 that the real produce of Shmita is what you get from trees and vines plus wild plants. So it's very much a fruitopian kind of concept, utopian, but fruitopian. And a preference, of course, for less invasive things like perennials. Again, the Chazon Shmita sourcebook asks us, as consumers of agriculture, can you even identify which foods were perennials and which were annuals? Do you think about that at Aldi? Do you think about that at whatever the groceries are these days? Right? And are they balanced in our own preferences and our own habits? A reminder that of the 7 biblical species, 5 of them are, right, 4 are fruits and 1 is grape from vine. Only 2 are annuals. So it's really wheat and barley and those equivalent staple crops that are at the heart of the Shmita conversation. The rest of it are going to be sustainable if we practice reasonable agriculture. And then thinking about the difference between wild and cultivated. How often do you harvest foods from the wild? Or for that matter, harvest foods with your own hand, even from your own windowsill or greenhouse or backyard, etc. And finally, the last piece of this, the climate conversation specifically around sustainable agriculture. This applies to animal feed as well. We think about how much mind-boggling amounts of cereal and soy crops, all of which are raised with Roundup and intense till agriculture, the vast majority of it is not consumed by humans. It is fed to cattle, who are notoriously inefficient, which is why the carbon footprint of a pound of red meat is approximately 16 times higher than the carbon footprint of 1 pound of equivalent, like tofu or something like that. So there are real questions here about the climate impact of what's on our plate. And Shmita asks us to ask those questions. Again, from Chazon Shmita sourcebook, how would removing all fences and cages around our domesticated animals, allowing them truly free access to wild pasture and food, affect our systems of animal husbandry and crop farming? And if you know anything about CAFOs, concentrated animal farming operations, where something like 95% of American meat, dairy, and eggs come from, we would quickly realize that this is not a model, that what we have now is not sustainable by Shmita ethic. How much does that call into question what we do ourselves? Recent study summarized in nature.com, emissions on the menu, about the greenhouse gas pollution rates of food production and how much of that is animal related. And we have to ask these questions. We have to compare, look at the red is animal products versus everything else from the agricultural sector. When we think about what we eat, when we make a daily choice, am I going milchig or fleischig today, right? Am I gonna order the veggie burger or the beef burger or the turkey burger? Those questions need to be asked, and they are Shmita questions. There's a whole lot more here, but you look at the healthy eating, this is the planetary health diet that this study came up with, and you see animal protein is on there, but it is the 6th largest, behind plant protein, behind fruits, behind whole grains, behind vegetables by a long shot. Compare that image on the left with the North American diet on the right and look at animal and dairy at the top when they shouldn't be. And what's that doing to our bodies? And what's that doing to the ecosystem? So, do you grow your own? How aware are we of seasonality, of what's local, of carbon footprint? How are we doing at feeding everyone even now with nearly 8 billion people and the current food system without Shmita? What if big ag ceased? How much of Earth and its produce is rightly ours to begin with? And if Shmita is 1 year in 7, but eco-kashrut, asking these questions in light of what is acceptable to eat, is a core Jewish approach, then what does that look like the rest of the time? There you have it. Some questions raised by this beautiful, baffling, challenging piece of Torah. Have at it. Thoughts, questions, discussions. I'm going to go with the chat, but anyone who wants to unmute.
There's a number of comments in the chat which we can look at afterwards, but let's start with hands being raised here in the here and now. So Nicole has her hand raised. Go ahead, Nicole.
So Rabbi Fred, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I really am enjoying this series very much. I am wondering how we can conceptualize Shmita as a move against corporate control of life. Obviously, you know, right now, those of us who live where we live and are not on a subsistence farming basis, you know, have to interact with corporate concerns to purchase our food. Are there any movements that you know about that help to break that cycle, to become freer from those sorts of constructs?
Beautiful. Yes. So in particular, a lot of the youth energy around Shmita from the Jewish Youth Climate Movement under chazon.org, and that you see in some progressive Jewish pockets, including the amazing community in Detroit, now that Avodah is active there, and the downtown synagogue that my friend Rabbi Ariana Silverman is an amazing reform rabbi who used to be a member of Adat Shalom. So, and your sister congregation in Detroit, and there's some of it in anywhere there's a college campus too, right? Asking these big questions of structure. Yes, and we need more of it. So thank you for asking. I'm not an expert in it, but this is part of that Shmita conversation. Pick it up. Talk with young people who are in the trenches of doing these analyses and asking the questions that don't simply accept a status quo that we have all grown up with. And not to put too much of it in a generational divide, but it is disproportionately happening with the younger folks. And some of you teach them and some of you raise them and all of you know them. So be part of that conversation. Thanks, Nicole.
Stephanie has her hand raised.
Hi, I was just wanted to add a little bit to what Nicole was saying. She brings up just a really good point that we have to get rid of corporate control. And I don't know of any movements, and I would love to find out about them. But one thing that Matthew and I do in Toronto is that we eat less meat than we would normally want to. And we buy it from a small local butcher, and they only buy from organic farmers. And it's way more expensive than buying meat, say, at Costco. And so we eat less and we just pay the extra price because we're supporting a small business. I just feel like that's something of a start that we try to do.
Amen. And thank you. And that's a great example. There's Grow and Behold Foods. There's Cole Foods here in Silver Spring, Maryland. People who are trying to do as ethical as possible, truly free range, truly organic, truly sort of human and animal rights oriented and kosher, and it ends up being, you know, filet mignon prices for hamburger. But that's the right. Is hamburger on the shelves at Kroger sustainable? Right. And does it pass the eco-kosher test, much less the traditional kashrut, much less the Shmita kashrut? Probably not. Beautiful dialogue here, most recently with Elizabeth and Norma asking about the ethics of feeding pets generously. I actually have always been uncomfortable with the, you know, cats and dogs in the numbers that we have them, because we're essentially chopping up one kind of animal to feed to another, and we're pitting species against species. And you look at what goes into most of puppy chow, or right, it may not be the parts that we find most appetizing, but it drives up the profitability of the meat industry, and therefore allows for more of this to happen and more of Earth's surface to be used in this way. So yes, Spot and Fido, and you know, they're part of the question. And yes, as Norma says, expect to be canceled, right? Because it's hard to ask these questions when we get into pet ownership, when we get into people's diets, when we get into people's reproduction. Again, population is not unrelated to this. We can't tell people what to do. We're on thin ice the moment we open any of those conversations, and yet we will not solve the climate crisis without solving sustainable agriculture. And that includes that the average Western affluent diet amount of animal protein needs to come down radically. So great questions. So much good stuff here. Right.
Let me ask a question, because I think we are on the right track, you know, with this conversation, and I really appreciate the ethics of it, and I also appreciate the urgency of it. What I wonder about, though, is how it's in tension with two things. One, the affordability for people who you know, can't afford to pay higher prices for the organic meats, or you know, as you put it, the filet mignon price for hamburger. So there's the economic issue. And number two, if we got rid of big ag with 8 billion people, as you put it, in the world, and I think it's more than that now, are we looking at starvation as a result? You know, are people going to die? Is this Shmita consciousness only achievable on a smaller scale as opposed to a worldwide scale? Or is there going to be a real price to pay for that? I guess there's a price to pay both ways. But is that do we need to also think about that?
We need to also think about that. Thank you. Yes, amen. I don't assume that all of you are fans of the Marvel movie Enterprise. My niece got me into it. But there was this, you know, this whole world of the Avengers and superheroes and whatnot. And the big finale a couple years ago was when the arch-villain Thanos has a plan to simply cut the human population in half by snapping his fingers, which he does at the end of one movie. It gets undone in the next movie. And it's so interesting because along the way, they make some effort to have his position make sense, right? We are baking in intense future suffering if we simply don't ask those questions, don't act sustainably for the next round of growth, and then we hit the wall, whatever that wall may be. And we almost hit it in the last 2 years, right? We barely had people being able to get to work. The supply chains came perilously close to snapping in many industries. And in the middle of it, we also saw one cargo ship bullocks up the Suez Canal with 13% of global international traffic going through that one contested waterway, right? We have systems that are mountains dangling from a thread. That's rabbinic language, but it's right. We have systems that are not particularly resilient. And the more people are dependent on those not necessarily resilient systems, the more people will suffer when they hiccup, when they break. And since we didn't ask that question when global population was at 2 billion, we have to ask it when it's at 8. And if we don't ask it when it's at 8 billion, we're going to have to ask it when it's at 12 or 13. And we already have crowded out other species. We already have had the CO2 graph going up, the hockey stick image. We already have lost a tremendous amount of topsoil that we're dependent on generation after generation to make sure future people get to eat at least as well as we do. We have to ask those questions. They are not easy. They are not comfortable. There is no obvious answer, and we have to ask them.
I appreciate, Nicole, you have your hand raised, but I just wanted to also check in with you, Rabbi Dobb. I think you had another piece you wanted to touch base about this today. Am I right? There's more?
There's always more. I happen to have more ready, but it's a question, do we want to get to that now, or do we want to say that's a big part of what the final session will be and focus more on the personal, spiritual, communal side?
Okay, let's ask the question of the group then.
Do we keep going with this conversation or go back to a few more slides to think about the psycho-spiritual side of Shmita?
I vote for more slides.
N equals 1 so far. I'm not going to call the question, but
I think
it works.
We have a second for psycho-spiritual here, I see.
That's the danger, of course, of asking, is it could well be exactly half and half. Back to Thanos, right? Half the people are going to be lost. Yeah.
Okay, I vote for psycho-spiritual. I'm a third.
All right, fair enough. Right, but yes, just to finish that earlier thought, Thomas Malthus, of course, was the famous, older philosopher who first asked those questions, and they're not going away just because we've dodged them up to now. And the famous debate about the famous Club of Rome, the group that wrote in the early 70s about the impending collapse. Well, the impending collapse didn't happen partly because we heard those warnings and began to heed them, but not at the level, only to stave off the inevitable, not necessarily to preclude it altogether. There are others, of course, who say technology always solves for everything. And all we need to do is bake in continued technological growth, and that will take care of the problems. And there are others who say, horse feathers, we can't rely on that. That's the current debate over carbon capture and sequestration, which is a really important area of research, but there's no hint that it can get to scale in the time frame that it's needed. That doesn't mean we shouldn't keep researching it, but we also shouldn't say, let's go on emitting as we are now without major changes because we think something like that will be a breakthrough technology in the future. And I'm going to wager my great-grandchildren's security on that, assumption. That's essentially what we are doing now. And that is perhaps not the way we should be doing it. All right. So many great thoughts in the chat. I haven't been able to absorb most of them, and I apologize. And I'm going to suggest that, Matthew, if we can save this, and then some of the richest chat questions can be the basis for the fourth and final session, right? If we're going to actually get through the rest of it now, let's try that. Awesome, and thank you. And here we go, one more round. So we were on agriculture with that adorable kid. And then part 2, got your graphic here, right? Resilience, spirituality, and community around this radical release that we need to be practicing, remembering that those are just some on a long list of Shmita consciousness concerns. Agriculture this time, economics and class and race last time, climate the time before that, and resilience, spirituality, community. At the heart of all of those is release. Again, literally Shmita. Okay, so personal renewal and release. Article from earlier in the pandemic from our local rag. The pandemic has caused parents to slow down. Here's how to preserve that pace. And right, it may seem daunting to preserve a slower pace once we think we can reopen and we're going to go back to the rat race. But there are ways. Create a list. Think of pros and cons of your life when it is quiet and make that a reference point. Establish boundaries. Make one slow choice and savor it. Set up reminders. I love this. Put a reminder right now in your Google Calendar for August 1st, when you, in the middle of summer break, are beginning to plan the year. And I say that also to myself and Matthew and Nicole and the Jewish professionals in our midst, right? Do not schedule extra stuff in September. And maybe not in October or November either, right? And make sure you do schedule do nothing time. Have Shabbat, have Shmita show up in your daily and weekly planner. April or Aviva Baskin, personal friend, important leader in the larger Jewish community, now runs a blog and a program called Joyous Justice. And she wrote in October a Shmita entry. The obligation is not to release what's easy to release. The spirit of Shmita is to release even when release is hard. What would it look like to mindfully live into a kavanah, an intention for this Shmita year? Hers is about her own background and not hiding anymore. What is ours? And she then goes broad, right? Asking us to consider what protections or patterns of behavior are you holding on to that are actually holding you back? What could you courageously release that would help move you toward your own and our collective liberation? That's the right question, right? We need to ask what we release of a status quo that is unsustainable, that is unjust, that is carbon intensive, that has structural racism baked into it. And we need to ask of ourselves about our patterns of behavior and what we can courageously release to help move us toward our own and our collective liberation. It's scary, but we can do it together. Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook died in 1935, became first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of pre-state Palestine in 1919. But 10 years before that, he wrote a book called Shabbat Haaretz, the Sabbath of the Land, an entire book about Shmita in the context of what was then the second Aliyah, the socialist youth of the kibbutz movement. It was small but influential. 1909 is a really interesting year. That's when the first kibbutz, Degania, that Aleph Dalet Gordon was on, was founded. It's when Tel Aviv was founded, and it's when Rav Kook wrote the book on Shmita. And he was a mystic. He was an Orthodox rabbi, but he was also kind of a proto-environmentalist. And he asks some really important questions about the interplay of land and law and soul. Life can only be perfected through the affording of a breathing space from the bustle of everyday life. Tel Aviv was just declared, by the way, the most expensive city in the world, right? And Tel Aviv was literally founded the year he wrote this. So I don't know what hustle bustle he has in mind, but it was nothing compared to a modern Lansing or Detroit or Tel Aviv, for sure. The individual shakes oneself free from ordinary weekday life at short and regular intervals. We have every Shabbos. What Sabbath achieves regarding the individual, Shmita achieves with regard to the nation as a whole. This year of solemn rest is essential for both nation and land. And then he uses terms that Heschel will pick up on in his famous book, The Sabbath. A year of peace and quiet without oppressor and tyrant, recognizing that we can be the tyrant of the land if we are not conscious of letting it rest. And that for that matter, the work can become our tyrant if we are not conscious of letting go. A year of equality and rest. And so far, we're in all of it. This could have been in the agriculture section. This could have been in the justice section, right? But it is also a year in which the soul reaches out toward divine justice. Time for the soul to reach out toward God, who sustains the living creatures with loving kindness. Without private property, without punctilious privilege, the peace of God reigns over all in which there is the breath of life. You hear the mystical language, you hear the frum Orthodox language, but there's something there for all of us. We need time to stretch out toward divine justice, toward that force with a capital F that sustains the living creatures with loving kindness. We need a little piece of God to reign over everything that has ruach in it, for sure. He also writes, there's a forcefulness inevitably part of our regular public lives, but it lessens our moral refinement. There's a tension between listening to that inner Musar voice, he was a Musar guy too, that calls us to be kind, truthful, and merciful, right? The Yetzer HaTov, the good impulse that is within us, in tension with conflict, compulsion, and pressure to be unyielding from the marketplace, from buying, selling, and acquiring things. These market-driven aspects of the world of action distance us from the divine light and prevent it from being discernible in the public life of the collective. This distancing permeates the morality of individuals like poison, stilling the tumult of social and economic life from time to time in certain predictable ways, i.e. Shmita, is meant to move this nation, when it is well ordered, to rise toward an encounter with the heights of its inner moral and spiritual life. When we are in quarterly profit cycles, when we get at most, our 2 weeks of vacation, when we don't build sabbatical in, irrespective of the profession that we're in, how much time do we have to encounter with the heights of our inner moral and spiritual life? To try to bring our divine qualities and our social arrangements toward perfection. This is yet another infinitely valuable piece of the Shmita puzzle. And it directly connects with community. The final appearance of the 7th year cycle in Torah is near the very end. Moses is 120, he's about to exit stage left. And right before Ha'azinu, chapter 32, his final poem, and then V'zot HaBracha, that we read only on Simchat Torah, telling the story of his death, this is his last sort of halachic address in Deuteronomy 31. And he gives a new piece of Torah at the very end. Miketz Sheva Shanim, at the end of every 7-year cycle, the Moed, at the holy Time, B'chag HaSukkot, at the festival of Sukkot, Shnat HaShmita, this is the year of remission, the year of Shmita, when all Israel comes to appear before the eternal your God in the place God will choose. Let the people come together for the pilgrimage festival that is Sukkot. Read this teaching aloud in the presence of all of Israel. What teaching? This teaching. The whole Torah? We don't know. Hakel. This is the imperative from kahal, kehillah, as in your own community's name, right? Kehillah is community. Hakel is the imperative, make community, gather. The imperative to gather at ha'am, the people, all the people, ha'anashim ve'hanashim, the men and the women. In patriarchal society, you don't have to say the men, you do have to say the women. They are included here. Hataf, the kids, the gercha asher bisharecha, unless you think this is only reserved to people who have a social security number and full citizenship. No, also the immigrant, also the ger. L'man yishma'u, l'man yilmadu, so that they will hear and learn to revere God, observe faithfully, even their children who haven't had the experience, hear and learn to revere eternal your God as long as we're around. At Edat Shalom, we have a custom at the end of a Shmita year on Yom Kippur, which is just a few days before Hakel, we make this the maftir on Yom Kippur morning. Just 1 year in 7, and that'll be this year. For what it's worth, something to play with. I find it more inspiring than the Numbers 28, the list of sacrifices of the old holy days. Supposedly at Sukkot, at the end of a 7-year cycle, it's not clear whether this means the Sukkot of Shmita or the Sukkot just when Shmita has ended. There's a debate in our sources about that, but every 7 years connected to the rhythm of Shmita, you gather all the people and you re-covenant. Community, micro-community is baked in through the whole thing. How else are you going to survive when there's no private property anymore? But meta-community is also a core consideration. While we're on Torah, what better to do when you have free time than to study Torah? This is Ibn Ezra, 12th century Spain, commenting on Hakel. He believed that it was the opening of the Shemitah year, right? So why would, this is summarized by Rabbi Aaron Finkelstein, good stuff on the left, but going straight to the Ibn Ezra, why would they do this? Why would the Jewish people begin Shemitah by reading Torah out loud to the whole community, everyone, so they will hear and learn and observe? Shmita, says Ibn Ezra, was ushered in through Torah study. And elsewhere he says, Kol Hashanah, this Torah study was to continue throughout the entire year. For Ibn Ezra, the purpose of Shmita was, quote, the suspension of work to facilitate the study of Torah. That's a little bit like telling a rabbi or a professor, okay, you get sabbatical, but you have to be doing work every bit as much as you usually do. We're not going to question the rhythms of work. We're not going to question the overall idea that everything is output driven. It's just you get to do different Torah, right? That's a little bit of what Ibn Ezra is saying, because what could be better than studying Torah if you're Ibn Ezra? Maybe if you're you. I completely agree that needs to be part of it. But putting it all together, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, now again a Reconstructionist rabbi as well as a renewal leader, and going back to the 70s, he was really one of the first people to usher in the Shemitah revolution, talking about this as something we need to lift up in the modern period as Shemitah consciousness. In his book, God Wrestling, he summarizes this so beautifully, putting in context Shabbat and Shemitah and Yovel and life. We need Sabbath, acceptance and celebration of mystery over mastery. That doesn't mean we curse modernity, technology, work, production, consumption, accumulation. It does mean we have to put them in their proper place within a Sabbath framework. And that's not just the literal Sabbath of seventh day, nor extended Sabbaths of seventh month, year, 50th year. It's a whole approach of mind and practice. Shemitah is part of a larger puzzle of a path of life to affirm the worth of dawdling on that path. We presented this at Edat Shalom and right before winter break, and we had 2 therapists plus my co-rabbi Rachel. And I'm just very quickly, these are the slides left over from their presentations. But Beth Sperber-Ritchie worked with the International Landmine Association. She was working with survivors of landmines who have, of course, massive PTSD, emotional and physical impairment. And her research showed there are kind of these 6 areas that we can begin to think in our individual, in our treatment, in our families, in our social support, in our economic situation, and in our society. Resilience needs to show up in every one of those ways. And as social science researchers, particularly mental health, are wont to do, you go sometimes to the extreme in order to figure out what we all need. So thank God, most of us have not had a limb lost to a landmine, but thousands of living people, tens of thousands have, and we can learn from their experience. She brings in Audre Lorde as a woman of color, reminding us not just marginal populations, but in particular those who have that collective trauma behind us, that caring for ourselves is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. So take that, anti-Semites, take that, white Christian nationalists, right? Jews will not replace us. Oh yeah, we're going to take care of ourselves by giving ourselves Shmita, and in the process, we're going to save the world. Take that, right? So she talks about the need for a self-care and resilience plan. We need to be planful. This is Shmita consciousness in language of therapy, right? We need a plan. We need to recognize the signs of burnout so that we capture the very opening stages. We need to identify all of our unhealthy habits, everything that is unsustainable that we just do because we haven't thought enough about it. In all of those areas, the interpersonal, physical, emotional, spiritual, cognitive, financial. We need to use our strengths as well, focus on our weaknesses, focus on our strengths, remember how we did it the last time that we overcame a major challenge, because that's what Shmita is. Shmita is resilience. If you take away the way that you normally feed yourselves and you practice doing it on a regular basis, you are practicing resilience. You are creating muscle memory to be ready for a crisis, ready for a pandemic, ready for a snapping of supply chains, ready for a massive geostorm, ready for a zombie apocalypse, ready for, right, you name it, right? And develop a plan for small, healthy changes, because you only need to change 14% a year if you bake Shmita consciousness in 7 years. You don't need 1 year of radical privation and then 6 years of radical accumulation. This is Shmita consciousness, is small healthy changes all the time in every one of those areas. David Kirsch, another therapist member, talked about solastalgia, a word that I had never heard of. He introduced it by noting there's a place out west in Northern California where he went when he was a kid. He's brought his family since, and I just have to say, because these are his slides, except I added one picture that some of you will recognize. He took his daughter Isabel, who is just now finishing college, though she took a gap year to work on Capitol Hill. That's a clue. And took her on her first vacation in the age of COVID. And before I show where this is going around resilience, that's her on the left. And you met last session, Leo Wisty, who is the director of Michigan Interfaith Power and Light. And that's me on the right. And we're standing in front of Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin's office before we had a conversation with her legislative person around climate issues, because my Adat Shalom, I did her bat mitzvah, the same daughter that David Kirsch is presenting about, was interning with Alyssa Slotkin. Yet again, Central Michigan and the DMV are connected. I love that. I had to just put that in. But back to his thing, he took his daughter on their first vacation in the age of COVID to go to this childhood place in Northern California, and they literally ran into the Caldor fire. Solastalgia is the distress caused by environmental change. It's been named by therapists. It's in a series of psychoterratic disorders, including nature deficit disorder, eco-anxiety, global dread. All of these things are impeding our resilience because we have impeded the resilience of the natural world, because we have not lived with Shmita consciousness and built that into our economic, environmental, social ways. So there's a whole list of therapeutic things that help define solastalgia, the lived experience of the loss of the present, manifest in a feeling of dislocation. But the key, and the reason why it's so powerful, is that solastalgia may seek its alleviation in a future that has to be designed and created. It's a psychological disorder that we can collectively do something about by designing and creating a future that averts the worst. So simultaneously, we are on planet B because we've already altered it, and there is no planet B because we can't alter it too much and think we're going to go somewhere else. Re-enchantment is part of this. And then finally, Rabbi Rachel did a presentation that went right to Mishnah Peah from that section of the Mishnah called Zra'im, seeds, to remind us of the agricultural basis of simply being a good person. And there's a famous passage from there that's in the opening of traditional prayer books, not Kol HaNeshama, but it's worth studying anyway. It would take us afield to draw out what she did. She then led us in yoga poses as during our Shmita workshop. I'm not going to do that because I am not a certified yoga instructor. Rabbi Rachel Hirsch of Adat Shalom is. But yoga or the traditional Siddur are both ways of building our individual resilience. It is really to ask, what is your spiritual practice? How are you strengthening your inner core so that you are ready for anything? I showed you this slide before from this article about parenting during COVID and looking ahead to late COVID or post-COVID and the need to try to hold on to some of the slowness. Here's why. You hadn't seen this one before. The last piece of advice is preserve positive pandemic routines. Think about what's been good from these last 22 months. Because calendar, Tetris, and multitasking were the name of the game for many families pre-pandemic. And we now have a unique opportunity to advocate for less instead of more. A unique opportunity to tune into what we care about, to be intentional about our time, i.e. to live Shmita consciousness, because we've all been through a collective dislocation. COVID closures have been a collective Shmita of a sort, a traumatic one, an unfortunate one, a painful and deadly one. Doesn't mean we can't learn from it. As Hemin Sunim, the Zen Buddhist teacher, right, and author of the book, I haven't read it, but I love the title, The Things You Can See Only When You Slow Down, How to Be Calm in a Busy World, right? How to bake an extra 14% of restfulness into every year, because we live with Shmita consciousness. That is slowing down. A great Zen master was once asked by the student what the ultimate enlightenment experience was, and the answer, in classic Zen style, when you drink tea, just drink tea. Sometimes the little things are the big things. And we won't know that if we don't slow down, if we don't take seriously this kind of learning, which we can reasonably enough call Shmita consciousness learning. So there you have it, community, spirituality, personal renewal, and release. It's all Shmita. Discuss.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Fred, for this most engaging and enlightening discussion. Lots to think about, lots to reflect on. I love how you took us through not only the global focus about agriculture, but that you then took us into a realm of self-reflection, and indeed our just engagement within ourselves, with our Jewish community, with our worship, how we think about Jewish liturgy and what that implies for us, as all connected to Hakel, to community, which ultimately is connected to the self and self-care. Lots to think about. I want to thank you all for coming. We'll do is we'll sign off for now, but I think you've given us plenty to think about to bring back for next month's session, which I should have had the date in front of me and I don't. Do you have it handy?
Yes, February 6th.
So February
4 weeks
6th.
from today.
And that'll be our last session. So please come with your questions and comments and reactions to things that we've discussed thus far. And we'll definitely make time to build on everything we've discussed, to wrap it all up. And I'm sure that we'll also have some new material to think about then as well.
For sure. Keep adding to the chat or keep emailing Matthew or Nicole, and keep it going. I love Norma's. I want to let Norma have the last word here. This vision is so countercultural, which on the one hand sounds utopic and pie in the sky, like all the Jewish prophets. And that's exactly the point. This is prophetic. And I'm not positioning myself as a prophet. I'm just quoting the prophets of our time, the scientists and the mental health practitioners and the people thinking about what is sustainability actually going to take and how we're going to get there. And
now before we go, I do want to open it up for Nicole, because we have a special program which is related and relevant to Shmita, and it's happening for Shmita next week. So go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I was so enthralled with the program that I completely forgot. I'll put it in the chat. We are hosting an all ages event at Fenner Nature Center next week. Our wonderful KI member, Bill Schneider, who cultivates wild type plants. He gathers seeds from the wild with permission and cultivates them and sells the plants. Many of us know who he is, does wonderful work. He's going to lead the adults on a nature walk that ties in with the whole Shmita series. And I'm going to lead all the children on a walk that will tie in the Shmita consciousness concepts that we've been discussing. We will be gathering at 11 a.m. at Fenner, rain or shine, snow or sleet. So if you live in Michigan, you've got the gear, put it on, and we'll go. And I'm really excited about it. Thank you, Rabbi, for reminding me.
And thank you, Nicole, for organizing this. And I look forward to participating in the program with you and to seeing you all there. Thank you all. Take care.
Bye.
Lihitrot.